Hi everyone and welcome to today's PER Masterclass. My name is Dawn McKenna and I am also joined by Heather Murmur, who will be presenting today, as well as my colleagues Jackie and Joanna, who will be on hand to answer your questions during the session. We are from ACCA's Professional Development team and we're delighted that you can join us today. In this session, we will focus on the supervision of your PER. But before we begin, I just need to cover a few housekeeping items. To get the best experience, please watch this webinar in Google Chrome if possible, and if you have any problems with visuals or sound, please try refreshing your browser. There are presentation slides as well as widgets, and these can be adjusted to be made larger or smaller according to your own personal preference. There are a selection of useful links and resources available in the resources section of the webinar. And you can use the Ask a Question widget to send us your questions. And you can send us these at any time, and we will answer them directly via the chat function. And if we have some time at the end, we can answer some of the most popular topics live. And finally, today's session will be recorded. So after the session has ended, you will receive a link to allow you to rewatch this webinar at your leisure. In today's session, Heather and I will begin with a quick overview of the PER requirement. We will then move on to the role of the Practical Experience Supervisor, as well as who can be your Practical Experience Supervisor. We will also look at how to work with your Practical Experience Supervisor in order to complete your PER. We will briefly cover the Remote Practical Experience Supervisor programme and what to do if you are working for an approved employer. We'll then finish by covering PER audits, what they are and what to do if you are selected for an audit, and then highlighting some of the resources that are available to you and your supervisor. So let's get started. As you know, there are 3 parts to becoming an ACCA member: exams, ethics, and experience, and they are all equally important. Professional ethics is at the heart of the ACCA qualification. It is covered extensively within our exams, our practical experience requirement, and given special attention within the ethics and professional skills module. Today's webinar is about the experience component of the ACCA qualification, which is known as PER. The practical experience requirement is a really important part of the ACCA qualification because it shows employers that you can apply the knowledge and techniques gained through your studies in the workplace. It is an opportunity for you to gain deeper understanding of what you have learned in your studies towards the ACCA exams as you apply your learning in the workplace. And if you are studying while you work, the real-world learning you gain can help you succeed in your exams. PER provides you with the breadth and depth needed as a foundation to becoming a professionally qualified accountant, and you will be supported by a practical experience supervisor, giving you the confidence to succeed in your training and ongoing career. Furthermore, to complete the PER, you will need to reflect on the skills and knowledge that you gain through your experience, which is an important practice as you become a lifelong learner. As you may already be aware, there are 2 key components to achieving the PER. Firstly, you need to achieve a minimum of 36 months of supervised experience in a relevant accounting or finance role. As you complete your experience, you will also need to demonstrate that you have achieved a set of performance objectives. You don't need to gain your 36 months of experience continuously or in just one single role. You can gain your experience at different times and in different roles. You can also use experience that you gained in previous roles, even before you registered as an ACCA student. So what is a relevant role? This is a role where your time is spent on accounting, finance, or audit assurance tasks, or maybe in other technical specialisms, such as taxation, insolvency, forensics, or management accounting. You can also use experience you gain in voluntary work and internships, as well as experience that you may have gained in a part-time role. You would just accrue the 36 months of time a bit more slowly. You can also gain experience in a partially relevant role. So, for example, if you only spend 50% of your time on accounting or finance tasks, then you can still use this experience to count towards your PER. However, like a part-time role, you would just accrue your time more slowly. It's important to remember that it doesn't matter what sector or organisation you work in to gain your PER. All of these different types of experience can count that you can see on screen at the moment, provided that it was supervised by a qualified accountant. This is absolutely key. As you complete your practical experience, you will need to complete a set of performance objectives, and you will need to achieve 9 performance objectives in total. Objectives are how you demonstrate your effective performance in the workplace. If you have ever taken part in an appraisal process at work, you may find that performance objectives are similar to the objectives and expectations set by your manager. Objectives and the exams are closely linked, meaning that the knowledge and techniques that you've developed through your studies is applied in the workplace. And the tasks and activities that you will be asked to demonstrate are also closely related to the type of work that you will undertake on a regular basis in an accounting or finance role. The objectives are grouped into 2 categories, essentials and technical. On screen just now are the essentials. They place emphasis on professionalism and ethics, stakeholder relationship management, strategy, innovation and sustainability, governance and leadership. These are essential, fundamental business skills that all accountants require, so every ACCA trainee needs to achieve all 5 of these objectives. There are 17 technical performance objectives to choose from, and they fall into different technical areas. Trainees must complete any 4 from these 17 objectives, and they can complete the objectives in any order. We would always recommend that you choose the technical objectives that best align to your role, because you should find it much easier to achieve the performance objectives that link most closely with your everyday work. And if you choose an objective from one area, such as corporate and business reporting, you do not have to complete all of the others within that area. You can select from other subjects. We find that trainees are sometimes drawn towards the tax or audit objectives, so please only choose these particular objectives if you are working in a specific audit or tax role. This is because the level of experience that you need to achieve these objectives means that you will need to have worked on audits or in a tax environment on a regular basis. If performing audits or undertaking tax work is not a regular part of your role, it would be better to choose other technical objectives which better match the work that you do on a regular basis. As an example of a performance objective, you can see here the structure of Performance Objective 6. Each performance objective is made up of a description, which is a summary of the performance objective. You can see this at the top. And then underneath, 5 elements labelled A to E, which outline the specific tasks and behaviours that you must demonstrate to achieve the performance objective. To claim an objective, you must demonstrate carrying out the work activities that relate to the performance objective to a constant standard in the workplace. You will also need to write a 200 to 500 word statement summarising how you have achieved the objective. For full details of all of the performance objectives, including the descriptions, elements, and some example activities, we provide a performance objective booklet called Achieve. The Achieve booklet can be found on our website, and you can also download it from the resources section of this webinar. You will record all of your PER within the PER recording tool, which you will access via your My ACCA account. This is the dashboard where you can see an overview of your PER. It shows your most recent employment information and the amount of time you have accrued towards your 36 months total across all of your recorded roles. It will also summarise your progress in completing your performance objectives. You will use the recording tool to record your role and performance objective information, and to send your time and performance objectives to your supervisor for approval. Please note that if you are employed by an approved employer for the trainee development stream, and they allow you to follow the simplified approved employer route for your PER, then you will record your PER in a slightly different way from the standard route. And we will talk about working for an approved employer a little later in the webinar. As you're aware, and the reason why you all signed up today, in this webinar, we are focusing specifically on practical experience supervisors. If you feel that you need more detailed information on how to use the recording tool, you will find guides within the PR recording tool itself and on our website. You can also access an on-demand webinar which gives an overview of all aspects of PR, including how to use the recording tool. This is on our website and on YouTube, and links for those can be found in the resources section of today's webinar. It's important to note that any information recorded within your PR recording tool must be a true and accurate representation of your own practical experience. When you next log into the PR recording tool, if you haven't done so already, you will be prompted to sign a strict liability clause, that is, a declaration of integrity, to confirm that any information recorded within your PR recording tool is a true and accurate representation of your own practical experience. You will also be required to confirm your agreement to the clause whenever you submit time or a performance objective to your supervisor for sign-off. Your supervisor will also be required to confirm their agreement to a strict liability clause, confirming that the performance objectives they sign off reflect the work undertaken by yourself as you have evidenced it to them, and that it meets the required PER standards. I'll now move on to look at practical experience supervisors, beginning with the role of a practical experience supervisor. So what do practical experience supervisors do? Well, your supervisor should support you by helping to identify which performance objectives you should target, and maybe setting a target date which you should achieve them by. They'll help you to plan out the experience you need to achieve the performance objectives you're targeting. This may mean helping you to arrange job rotations, project work, or maybe a secondment so you can get a range of experience. Your supervisor should work with you to see if you need any personal development to help you achieve the necessary level of workplace performance required to achieve the objective. They may suggest training, research, or additional coaching to help you do this. They should regularly evaluate your progress towards your PER. And your practical experience supervisor is the person who will be responsible for signing off on your experience once they believe that you have met the required standard. So who can be your practical experience supervisor? There are different rules that mean your supervisor will be able to sign off both your performance objectives and your time, or they may only be able to sign off your time, or they may be only eligible to sign off your performance objectives. We know this can be confusing, so we'll now take a look at some scenarios to help you identify who could be your supervisor in your particular circumstances. Our first scenario is one that will apply to most of our affiliates, and that is that your direct line manager is a qualified accountant or auditor. By qualified, we mean that they are an accountant or auditor who is a member of an IFAC body, or that they are an accountant or auditor qualified by law in the country that you are based. IFAC is the International Federation of Accountants and includes member bodies from all over the world. We are often asked if supervisors need to be ACCA members, and the answer to this is no. While they can be an ACCA member, they can be a member of any IFAC body around the world, or be qualified by law. If you are unsure whether or not a potential supervisor is a qualified accountant or auditor, you can reach out to us today via the chat function, or you can email us at professionaldevelopment@acccaglobal.com with details of their qualification, and we will be able to advise. If you find this particular situation applies to you, that is, your line manager is a qualified accountant or auditor who is a member of an IFAC member body or recognised by law in your country of work, this means that your line manager can sign off both your performance objectives and your time. It is important to note, however, that your line manager can only sign off performance objectives that they have directly supervised. For example, they cannot sign off performance objectives if you demonstrated the achievement of the elements in a previous workplace but haven't yet had the chance to do so under their supervision and on your current role. Moving on to our next scenario. What if your direct line manager is not a qualified accountant or auditor, and they are not a member of an IFAC member body or recognised by law in the country of work where you're based? If your direct line manager is not qualified, they can still sign off your time. However, they would not be able to sign off any performance objectives. To get your performance objectives signed off, you would need to find an alternative qualified person who is more senior to you to be your supervisor and to work with your line manager to sign off your performance objectives. Firstly, you would consider if there is a qualified person who is more senior to you working internally at your organisation. For example, your department head, or maybe someone in a different department. They would then regularly meet with you and your line manager to review and then subsequently sign off your performance objectives. However, sometimes you may not be able to find a qualified person within your organisation. For example, you work in a small organisation, or your organisation does not employ a professionally qualified accountant. Or maybe you're the most senior person in your organisation within the finance team. In this case, you would then need to consider whether there is an external person, such as a consultant or your organisation's external auditor, who knows your work, to be your supervisor, and again to work with you and your line manager to review and sign off your objectives. Any supervisor, whether internal or external, must meet regularly with you and, if applicable, your line manager to discuss your progress. Please remember, it is very important to note that any external person who you wish to act as a supervisor must have an existing business relationship with you and your employer to be able to supervise you to some capacity and be able to verify your experience. They cannot be a friend, associate, or even a previous mentor or lecturer. They must have a legitimate connection with your employer. Additionally, you should try and avoid having a friend or relative as your practical experience supervisor to prevent any potential conflicts of interest. However, depending on where you work and your situation, in the event that your practical experience supervisor is related to you, you must disclose this to ACCA as soon as possible, but at the latest when you apply for membership. It is important to note that any supervisor must have personally supervised the work that you are claiming for your PER. If, for example, you demonstrated achieving an objective in a previous role, your current supervisor would not be able to sign off those performance objectives, as they didn't supervise you completing the work. Similarly, you should not be asking a supervisor to sign off a performance objective if, within your statement, you have written about work that they have not personally supervised. This is something that we see quite frequently, and unfortunately have to decline performance objectives at the stage of a trainee applying for membership. So please make sure that you only write about work that your supervisor has personally supervised. As mentioned earlier, to sign off your time, your supervisor does not need to be IFAC qualified. If they are unavailable, someone from your HR department can also sign off any time claims. If you are planning to move to a new role before completing all of your PER, make sure that you have had any performance objectives and time signed off before you leave, as it may be difficult for you to contact and engage a supervisor from a previous employer to sign these off retrospectively, particularly if they themselves have now moved on to a new role. We are often asked, can I have more than one supervisor, or should I have more than one supervisor? And the answer to this is yes. For example, you may move to a new employer before completing all of your PER. In this case, you would need to find and register a new supervisor within or connected to your new employment. Another example may be that you have worked in more than one department and with more than one manager in order to gain your relevant experience. In this case, you would have more than one supervisor, and they would each sign off the performance objectives that you completed under their personal supervision. For example, you may report directly to your line manager, who will be able to help you complete the majority of the performance objectives. However, you may be working closely on a project with another manager, who may be able to support you on one or two particular specific performance objectives. Another example is that your supervisor may have moved to a new employer before you have completed all of your objectives. In this case, you would register a new supervisor to help you complete any remaining objectives. I will now hand you over to Heather, who will talk about how you will work with your supervisor. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you very much, Dawn. So we will now move on to talk about what to do once you've identified a practical experience supervisor. So once you have worked out who can be your practical experience supervisor, you'll need to enter their details into the PER recording tool and send them an invitation to register. You won't be able to submit anything to your supervisor for sign-off until they've registered, so make sure you invite them to register as soon as you can. To register your supervisor, you'll need to have added your role into the recording tool, and then you'll add your supervisor to your role details as shown on screen. You'll need to provide that information, and as a part of this, you'll be asked to select your relationship to your supervisor, and you can see the various options in the drop-down menu on the screen. So here you'll select whether they're an IFAC qualified line manager, a non-IFAC qualified line manager, an IFAC qualified internal supervisor, or an IFAC qualified external supervisor. And the relationship you indicate will determine whether the supervisor can sign off both time and performance objectives, or only time, or only performance objectives. Once you've done this and clicked on Save and Send Invite, an auto email will be sent to the supervisor, and this will include a registration link for them to follow the registration process. The exact process that they follow will depend on whether they've already acted as a supervisor for any trainees in the past, and full details of the process will be given to them in the email. So once you've registered your supervisor, you should agree with them how your relationship will be managed. For example, how often will you meet to discuss your progress towards achieving your performance objectives? Will your meetings be online or face-to-face? So you should agree your approach together to avoid any misunderstandings. Your supervisor is likely to have a busy schedule, and so remember to allow for this and to make the most of the time that you have scheduled with them, as well as taking responsibility for arranging and planning meetings. Think ahead about the agenda and anything that you need to discuss with them. You should decide with your supervisor which performance objectives you will target. And when selecting which performance objectives to target, you should consider the ACCA exams that you studied for, as you may find it helpful to choose the performance objectives that relate to these exams. And this way, you'll be able to put what you learned into practice. You could also match any business objectives that you've been set at work with the performance objectives, and this will allow you to work towards your business objectives and your PER at the same time. Ideally, your employer should give you the experience that you need to achieve the performance objectives. If your current role offers few opportunities, you and your practical experience supervisor will need to think of ways to gain relevant experience. So, for example, you might consider going on a secondment, doing a job rotation, or being involved in a project that will give you more necessary experience. You should also agree how and when your supervisor will review your performance objectives. These could be reviewed as and when you submit a performance objective to them, or it might be on a quarterly basis, or as part of your annual appraisal process. We've produced a booklet called Become a Practical Experience Supervisor, which you can give out to a potential supervisor, which will help them to understand what's involved. You can download a copy from the PER pages on the ACCA Global website, and you'll also find a copy to download in the resources section of today's webinar. There's also a dedicated webinar for supervisors, and this is available on the ACCA Global website. When you've demonstrated consistently achieving the elements of a performance objective within the workplace, and you've written a 200 to 500 word statement within the recording tool, you can submit the performance objective to your supervisor for their review and sign off. And you'll do this using the PER recording tool. The performance objective submission screen is shown here, where you can see an example of the detail of an objective that a trainee has added to their basket. And to send this to your supervisor, you would select their name from the drop-down list, then select the employer and the role where you completed the objective. You can add a comment for your supervisor if you want to. And after selecting that you agree to the strict liability clause applicable to ACCA trainees, you would then click on the Submit button highlighted in red. You may have multiple supervisors and multiple roles, so it's important to choose the correct supervisor and role where you gain this experience. I've just noticed that on this screenshot, it doesn't show where you would agree to the strict liability clause, so we need to get that updated. But when you go in and do this yourself, you will see a checkbox instructing you that you're signing that you agree to that strict liability clause again. So once you've submitted, your supervisor will then receive an email asking them to review what you've submitted to them. They'll either approve or decline the objective, and then they must leave a comment if they decline so that you know why they've declined it. You'll also need to claim your time. When you end date a role or you reach 36 months of time, you'll be prompted within the recording tool to claim your time by submitting it to your supervisor for sign-off. Within the claim time screen, you would simply select the practical experience supervisor that you want to send your time claim to from the drop-down list, as you might have more than one supervisor linked to the role. Again, you can add a comment if you want to, and then click the Submit button at the bottom of the page, highlighted in red. And again, you can't submit this until you reconfirm your agreement to the strict liability clause. Your supervisor will then receive an email asking them to review your time submission. I'm now going to take a few minutes to talk about a programme that we've introduced to help ACCA affiliates who don't have access to a qualified supervisor. If you don't have access to a qualified supervisor to sign off your performance objectives, then you might be eligible for our Remote Practical Experience Supervisor programme, which will match you with a trained volunteer ACCA member to act as your Remote Practical Experience Supervisor. This remote supervisor will work with you and your line manager to review your experience and sign off your performance objectives. You would need to build a relationship with your remote supervisor and demonstrate how you have achieved the performance objectives through meetings with them, confirmation from your line manager, and by sharing samples of work where appropriate. Once your remote supervisor is satisfied that the objectives have been achieved, they'll sign off your performance objectives in the recording tool. To be eligible for the programme, you must firstly be an ACCA affiliate, as the programme isn't currently open to students. You must currently work in a relevant accounting or finance role and be working towards the performance objectives. Experience from past employers can't be used to achieve the objectives with a remote supervisor, and this is because your remote supervisor must be able to communicate with your line manager, and you'll have to show evidence of your work. If your role is in auditing or in lecturing, then you won't be eligible for the RPES programme. And there must be no suitably qualified accountant either at your employer or external, but who has a business connection to your employer, such as a consultant or an auditor, who would be able to verify and sign off your performance objectives. And finally, you must have your employer's consent to take part in the programme. You'll be sharing details of your work, including examples, so your employer's consent is mandatory. You must also review your employer's confidentiality policy with your line manager to ensure that you understand what information you're allowed to share. Your employer will be required to give their consent as part of the online registration process. If you don't have access to a qualified practical experience supervisor and you think that you meet the eligibility criteria, then you may wish to apply. You can access the programme registration through your PER record on the employer role page, which is shown on screen. If you have recorded an eligible job role, then you'll see the pink message inviting you to take the questionnaire to check your eligibility. You'll then be asked a series of questions to assess if you meet the criteria, and if you do meet the criteria, then the next step of the registration process is to add your line manager to the recording tool, and they'll be asked to give their consent for the programme when they register in the tool as your line manager. If your line manager is already registered in the recording tool, then you don't need to register them again. Instead, they can log into their supervisor dashboard and confirm their consent. Once they have registered and given their consent, then you'll be granted access to the matching tool to find a remote supervisor. You can then create your profile in the matching tool and answer questions, and these will help match you to a supervisor based on criteria such as areas of expertise and location. Once you've been matched to a remote supervisor, you'll be able to send them a request to become your remote supervisor. And if they accept, then they will be automatically added to your PER recording tool, and you'll be able to send them performance objectives for review and sign off in the usual way. For more information on the RPES programme, please visit our dedicated pages on the ACCA website, which also has a selection of FAQ documents for trainees, employers, and remote supervisors. We'll now move on to look at approved employers. The Approved Employer Programme is an accreditation of an employer's learning and development policies and systems, and it's the trainee development stream that relates specifically to PER. To be accredited as an approved employer for trainee development, an organisation must employ appropriately qualified individuals who can act as practical experience supervisors. Working for an approved employer holding trainee development approval at either gold or platinum level allows trainees to claim the performance objectives in a simplified way, but doing this is always at the employer's discretion. If you want to check if your employer is an approved employer, then you should contact your HR department or your finance manager, as they will usually be responsible for the accreditation. If they're unable to provide you with this information, then you can check the Approved Employer database, and this is available on the ACCA website. Not all roles at an approved employer will be relevant, so it's really important to check that your role is covered by the scope of the approval. If you are working for an approved employer, you'll still need to meet the time requirement of 36 months, and you'll still use the PER recording tool to record your employment information, as this is how you'll inform us that you're working for an approved employer. However, to then claim your time and your performance objectives, rather than using the PER recording tool, you'll submit what's called a PER confirmation form. And this form will verify your time with the employer and the performance objectives that you've completed. Your approved employer primary contact or your practical experience supervisor will complete this form with you. You can see on screen an example of section 3, where the supervisor will confirm which performance objectives you've completed under their supervision. If you had more than one supervisor during your employment, their details can also be added to the form, and each supervisor can sign off the objectives that they supervised. Each individual performance objective must be signed off with either a handwritten signature or a digital signature. You can access the form in the recording tool when you add an end date to your role or when you've gained 36 months. And you can also find a copy of the form on the website and in the online application for membership. You can complete all of your experience with an approved employer, or you might leave before you complete everything with them. And if that's the case, we can update your experience to date based on what you submit on the form, and then you can complete whatever's remaining with your new employer. When you apply for membership, your PER is assessed to confirm that you've met the requirements. You may be selected for an audit of your practical experience, and you may also be selected for a PER audit when you're in the process of achieving your PER or even after you become a member. If you are selected for a PER audit, then your application will be referred to the Professional Development PER Audit Team, and you'll be notified accordingly. The audit team will review your full PER record. They'll review your employment history and verify your employment information. They may request additional supporting information from you, for example, your employment documentation such as contracts and official job descriptions, or a list of your activities and responsibilities from your line manager. The audit team will check your supervisor's information to confirm that they're suitably qualified, and they'll review your relationship to your supervisor. They'll also review your performance objective statements to verify that sufficient detail has been provided and cross-reference this with the information in your job description or provided by your employer. The audit team would contact you if they have any questions about the information that you provided in your PER. If there are any issues, you might be asked to redo some or even all of your PER. In the event that the team find any irregularities with your PER information, such as false employment information or plagiarised performance objective statements or false supervisor relationships, then there would be further investigation and you may be subject to a disciplinary, and your ACCA registration could be at risk. So as a recap, today we've looked at a brief overview of PER and where to find more information relating to the recording tool. We've looked at the role of a practical experience supervisor, as well as who can be a practical experience supervisor. We've also covered how to work with your supervisor to complete your PER. We then looked at the remote practical experience supervisor programme, as well as what to do if you're working for an approved employer. And then we finished with PER audits, what they are and what to do if you're selected for an audit. If you need to contact us, our contact details are shown on screen. You can either email info@acccaglobal.com, or you can call us or contact us online by visiting acccaglobal.com/contact us. There's a whole range of resources to help you and your supervisor with PER available on our website, acccaglobal.com, within the students and affiliates PER pages. And you'll also find a link to that in the resources section of the webinar today. Other resources include an essential PER guide, which is a detailed booklet telling you everything you need to know about the PER. 'er. There's a PER quick guide, the performance objective booklet called Achieve, and this gives details of all of the performance objective descriptions and elements, as well as example activities and how they link with the exams as well. There's also a very useful guide on writing your performance objective statements, and as we mentioned earlier, a dedicated guide for practical experienced supervisors. Within the PER pages of the website, you'll also find a link to an on-demand webinar providing a detailed overview of all things PER, as well as a dedicated on-demand webinar for supervisors. I'm now going to hand you back over to Dawn for some Q&A. Thanks, Dawn.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you to everyone who has been submitting questions. We've had such a wide range of topics today. We are covering supervisors, PR, objectives, what types of roles that can count, and what qualifications supervisors have. So thank you very much to everyone. I'll try and go through some of the most popular topics just now, but please continue to submit your questions during this. Heather, Jackie and Joanna will also be able to answer some of your questions via the chat function at the same time. So to answer one of the most common questions was, should volunteering be finance related? So yes, it will be if you're wanting to include it towards your PER. So we'll need to still follow the same rules as paid for employment. So for example, it would need to be a supervised, relevant accounting and finance role. Even if you aren't getting paid for it, or if it's an internship, it would need to still meet those requirements. And you would still need either your supervisor from that position or a connected supervisor to that position in order to sign off any performance objectives, as long as they are IPAC qualified. Someone has asked that can they access the PER tool even if they haven't started working yet? And yes, we actually strongly encourage this. So while you might not be able to record employment information so far, going into the tool, checking to see what information that we're looking for, what information you have to provide, and familiarising yourself with those performance objectives and the connected elements is a really good thing to do. As I mentioned earlier in my section of the webinar, we do have a booklet called Achieve, which details all 22 performance objectives, the description, the 5 elements, and the linked exams that relate to that objective as well. Please make yourself familiar with this document. You can download it from the resources. You can also download it from the website, but it will all help you when it comes to recording and achieving your PER. We have had a question regarding approved employers and if they need a practical experience supervisor. So you do still need a practical experience supervisor, however, they approve your experience slightly differently. So for those of you who have not achieved any experience with an approved employer for trainee development, so that's the route that covers PER specifically, you would record your employment within the PER recording tool, you would register a supervisor. When you register them, an invite is sent to them and they will then connect to your account. That means anything that you want to send to them, you do through your PER tool and they will be sent an email in order to approve this. If you're working for an approved employer, while you still have to record your employment details, so the name of your employer, where you work, and the relevance of your job role, you do not have to register a practical experience supervisor within the tool. All of your experience will be recorded on the approved employer PER confirmation form. This can be downloaded from the PER recording tool itself. There is a copy in the resources section of this webinar. It's on the website, and there's also a copy within the online application for membership. Within that form, I believe Heather showed some screenshots earlier on, your supervisor will give their details on that form. They will also approve any time that you have achieved in that role, and they will also sign off any performance objectives that you have achieved in that role. So while you still need that practical experience supervisor, they do not have to register in the tool. It will all be done via the paper form. I hope that helps. And connected to that, someone has asked, how do they know if their employer is an approved employer? So the first thing and the best thing to do is contact your finance department if that's not where you're currently based. They are normally responsible for the accreditation of your team or that have that approval. So definitely check with them first. If they don't know, then please check with your HR department, as they will also have a copy of this. The best thing to do, even if you believe that you are working for an ACCA approved employer for training development, is double check that your specific role or your specific team is covered by this approval. Not every role within an organisation will be approved because they won't all be working in accounting and finance. Therefore, you will have to make sure that your role is specifically covered. We wouldn't want you to assume this, and then when it comes to apply for membership, it turns out that you weren't covered and you would need to complete all those performance objectives retrospectively. All right. Again, very similar to the question earlier on, does voluntary internships count towards PER? So yes, as long as they are supervised, as long as you are working in a relevant accounting and finance role, then yes, they can count. What you will have to consider is the type of work that you're doing, if it allows you to claim any performance objectives. Depending on the length of time of the internship, you may not be able to achieve any, or you may be able to achieve one or two. So it's best to double check that before assuming you either can claim none or maybe some of the performance objectives. We have had a question regarding remote supervision and self-employed work. So someone has asked, I am self-employed, so I don't have a supervisor. Can I use an RPES? So unfortunately not, you would not be able to use a remote supervisor. In order for experience to count towards the practical experience requirement, this must be in a supervised capacity. So if you're working in a self-employed role, your work is not supervised, therefore it could not count towards PER. A remote supervisor would not be able to help in this situation. If you are in a self-employed role but maybe are subcontracting for an organisation and working for an organisation, for example, maybe bookkeeping or basic accounting and finance tasks, the person within that organisation who is supervising you may be able to act as your supervisor, but you would need to check that directly with them. And the last question, which is actually a really good question and covers quite a few queries that we've had today, is can my supervisor sign off my performance objectives if they are no longer working in the organisation? And the answer is yes, they can. So while they still have to be IFAC qualified and they can only sign off objectives that they overseen, they can approve that experience even if they have moved on to another organisation because they were your supervisor at that time. I hope that has answered everyone's questions today. We seem to have answered everything in the chat. I hope we've covered everything for you. If you have any further questions, you can contact us. I'll pop the information up on screen just now. We have our email address, our telephone number, or you can submit an online query form. You can also contact Heather, myself, Jacqueline, or Joanna at the Professional Development Team, and we'll be more than happy to assist you. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to welcoming you to membership soon. Bye-bye.